herself a survivor, but she went through hell.
When I think of a survivor, I tend to follow the definition that was developed by the conference that dealt with reparations. So it's either somebody who was in a camp, a labor camp or a concentration camp and survived, or somebody who was forced to flee from their homeland to avoid persecution by the Nazis or other regimes, or somebody who hid out during the course of the war in the Holocaust and managed to survive past the end.
All of the Jews that lived in Europe that had to survive this horrible, horrific genocide, even if they were sent out of the country and they were safe, it didn't matter. They all had the fear that was going on. They were all survivors.
The true survivors are those who not only survived the camps, but were able to start a new life and give life to a new generation such as us.
I think all of us feel very strongly about letting the next generation know.
My father spoke very little about his Holocaust experience. I knew he had lost a wife and 4 children, but that was about it as far as that family was concerned.
All I know is my father was one of 7 brothers, and my mother was one of 4. No one survived. No cousins, no uncles of their own. We tried, my parents tried, they never could trace anybody.
I think that a second-gen Holocaust survivor shares many things with other second-gen, not the least of which is that we have an insatiable need to somehow compensate our parent. We want to make something up to them. I would also say that what marks most of our experience, I can't say all, is that for as much as our parents wanted to spare us their horror, they wanted us to know, and that sent a conflicting message.
In 2008, my son Bill and I took a trip to Washington, D.C. There were several places we wanted to see. The Holocaust Museum was first. Bill was eager to see the exhibits bearing witness to the horrors his grandparents had endured. A lifetime of stories passed down by my parents provided no emotional buffer for either of us. We entered from the noisy street into a funereal hush that pervaded the museum. I remember us walking into an authentic boxcar used for transporting Jews to the camp. Its clean interior and bright display lighting masked the horror that took place within this space. I conjured up an image of my mother forcibly squeezing past other prisoners, seeking the boxcar corner with ventilation movers on its upper wall. This corner position, she had told me, when I was still a child, provided the best support for a slumpy body, and it also yielded the most snow. I thought of Mom with emaciated fingers, grasping through the boards for a bit of snow to put to her numb blue mouth. I lingered a moment, unmindful of others, until Bill tugged gently at my shirt sleeve, suggesting it was time to move along. We left the museum saddened and tense, but inspired to learn more. One evening, after a visit to the museum, I sat down at my computer and started scrolling through Holocaust archives. It didn't take long to scroll upon a large image of a man seated at his workbench, crafting a shoe. His expression was humble. My eyes welled up as I thought about the brutal process that produces such humility. This was my father, Ben Bourne, plying the trade he had learned as a young boy in his cousin's shoe factory.
Our lives, the second generation, was so much affected by our parents that it's really something hard to describe. I always felt that I need to look at behind my back or over my shoulder because somebody may follow me, somebody may hit me with a stone. I always did when I was a kid. I always did.
We all knew that there was something off about our parents. Not that they were dysfunctional, but there was something about them that I think was damaged in some way. And we never talked about it when we were young. And only as adults, when we reconnected, did we all discover we felt the same childhood, she was this adorable little woman, about 4'6", who spoke with a very heavy German accent. When she was about 14, her mother died of natural causes from botched surgery. And she was left at the age of 14 to care for her younger sister, who I think was about 5. Her father, who was much older than his wife, had again a nervous breakdown. And she also had to take over running the family store. This is all in itself remarkable. Add to this the fact that this occurred in the early 30s, when the Nazi Party has come to power and when they are tightening their grip on Germany. This is a time where she could go out and do family shopping for like 1 hour a day. Every time she stepped out of the house, her life was in danger. I once asked my mother when she was trying to leave, and she said, well, they called the head of the local Jewish community to Stuttgart, which was the closest big city, for consultation and to interview him. And he came home that night on the train in a sealed coffin. And she said that was when she knew she had to get out. So she tried to get exit visas for all 3 members of her family, her father, her sister, herself. So one day, she went to the consulate in Stuttgart after not getting any response. And she raced past the secretary and went into the consul's office and shut the door behind her. And simply told him that she was not leaving until she had 3 exit visas. And the man said, well, I can't do that. We don't work that fast. She said, you don't understand. If I don't become aware of those things, I'm going to tell them that you raped me with that she ripped her the blouse. She came home with 3 exit visas and got her family. Now, words fail me. I simply can't even imagine my tiny little mother like this. And my father's story is even more horrific because he spent time in Buchenwald concentration camp. And yet they were good parents, loving parents, caring parents. They doted on their grandchildren, my children. And there is a kind of a heroism there.
Diamond barter. Neither of my parents was in a position to have a diamond before the war, but my stepmother's family was. She told me her older sister had managed to conceal a diamond on her person for all the time they were in labor camp. At the end of the war, my stepmother and her sister were in a death march. My stepmother was still a teenager, and throughout her life, she really suffered when she was thirsty. They didn't get enough to drink on the death march, and my stepmother got to the point where she was so miserable she was not willing to keep walking. She told her sister that she was going to sit down, and she didn't care if she was shot. Her sister disappeared into the crowd and came back with a cup of water. She had traded it for the diamond. My stepmother drank it and, inspired by the sacrifice, kept walking. They both survived and lived many years afterward. Having hoarded these stories, I'm willing to barter them for understanding. Perhaps there will be understanding from those who read or hear them, but I think that I can also gain understanding of myself through these incidents and the feelings that they inspired in me.
This wasn't a casual, go to that county and round up the Jews and see who you can flush out. This was an efficient, organized approach to genocide at the highest level. To see my mother or father or their siblings reduced to a simple catalog entry with a number on it, that was such a hard reality.
I felt different. I knew that my parents were foreign. I knew they had gone through whatever they had gone through. I didn't know exactly what they had gone through, but through my father's talking, I gathered they'd gone through a lot. He was so concerned that people know. He thought
most people wouldn't believe any of the atrocities. And he saw Hitler's people take a baby by the feet and smash the baby's head against the brick wall. And he would tell me stories like that and say, I want you to pass along these kind of stories. And I promised him that I would tell people about it. I felt responsible for their happiness, and I find out that I'm not that different. There are other people that have very similar feelings.
Some of the things that I have to tell you about my father, it starts out that the reason why he knew that he wanted to leave Poland in the first place was that he went on a long walk with his own father out of the city of Lodz, because they were told right at the beginning of the war that every city was going to be the city that was going to be bombed by the Germans. And while my father was walking with his father, who was a Hasidic Jew, who wore a long coat, had a long beard and the side curls, and a hat, of course, you could tell that he was a religious Jew. He was caught by a group of soldiers, Nazi soldiers, and they really resented these religious people, and his father pushed him away and had him hide behind a bush, and my father watched these soldiers cut the skin off of his father's face with his beard. So my father saw that happen. And then also another incident before they left Poland was that he walked into the center of the city of Lodz. There were scaffolds all around, and there were about 12 Jewish people hanging from nooses. My father came in when all of the nooses were filled, so he was lucky. It just was one of those things. But they caught him too, and they made him clean up. He and many other men, they made them clean up the mess. So these two incidents happened to him, and each one of these things that happened to him was like an injury to his heart, I guess. And so, how can you feel bad when your father is mean to you when he's had that kind of a background?
This piece is to my relative Lost. In 1953, the State of Israel established Yom Hashoa to commemorate the 6 million Jews that perished during the World War II, the largest act of genocide in the world. On this day, we honor and mourn its victims along with the world that was destroyed. In many places, for special memorials, their country flag flaps in half-mast. I wonder how the world would look like with 6 million flags flapping in the wind. How the world would be illuminated by 6 million candles. I also try to imagine what kind of commanding echo would reverberate by reading all the 6 million names in the air.
My parents, losing 2 children, 11 and 13 years old, boys, Yeshua and Libman were their names. I don't know how they lived it, how they did it living at my time for that. I've got grandchildren now that are older than that. I don't understand how they made it through. I have the utmost respect for them now, so much more than I did when they were alive.
So my mother got out and came to New York by herself at 18, and at that point she was thinking she was gonna, that her mother would follow her, and her mother never got out. Her mother was murdered on a train that was taking all of the people in 1940, all the Jews out of Munich, where she lived.
Our mother, who didn't go into a camp like my father went to Buchenwald, and a lot of her friends, when she was living in Westcom, had numbers on them, and she always felt like she wasn't a survivor because she didn't go into a camp. But we always told her, what you went through makes you a survivor. You lost your family members.
They were young, they were able to work in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. My mother and her sisters worked in an area called Canada, which was the intake center. As soon as you got off the train, you got separated and you survived the German Shepherd dogs and the What happens is you go, you get disrobed, all your belongings, and you were told that you're going to get a shower from your long trip. And my mother worked there for quite a very long time, sorting through the clothes, because she was young, healthy, and able to provide work as a forced slave, and she could survive.
I realized how much they went through and how brave they were, especially my father, who was in some way, I would say, a visionary. It is just he wanted to protect his family and leave the country when, with all the things that were happening. And some way he felt that the local population is going to turn against them.
My mother had a box about this big. It was white, so it's about this tall. And I think on a Saturday afternoon, I would ask my mother, we'd take pictures. It was filled with photographs, and we'd take the photographs out. Here was this one, and here was that, and here was that, and how we related, and what happened, and what happened to them, and what have you. And so it was in my early teens that I sort of really had a strong awareness and began to sort of hear some of the story, not all of it, because I had to be the one asking the questions. My mother really never volunteered answers or responses or gave me information without me probing.
My mother would say, never throw away bread, because bread was what sustained them. It was the only food they pretty much had in Europe when they could get it. Mostly they starved, but in between starving, they could get bread. They would have to line up in Siberia in the freezing temperature, lines with hundreds of people waiting for bread. One story, they gave them raw dough, and she was afraid someone would try to steal it from her, so she put it inside her clothes. And as she walked back, it just kept rising and rising and rising and rising. That was one of the stories that, she looked like she was, 20 months pregnant by the time she got back to the hut that they lived in. The other story that is a much sadder story is that she waited in line for bread. And it was a time when they really hadn't had much to eat for 3 days. And so they were very, very hungry. And my father told her that morning that he would go out and try to find some work so that he could make some money and he could buy them something to eat. And she said her job would be to go and wait in line and get bread. And she went and she waited, and they finally gave each person just a little hunk of bread. And so she took it and hid it in her clothes. But while she was walking, she was so hungry that she took a little nibble. And then she took a little nibble more, and my mother kept taking little bits of this bread. And by the time she got home, the bread was gone. Because it was just a small little piece of bread to begin with. But she was completely hysterical because she knew that my father also was that hungry, that he could have eaten that whole piece of bread. And she didn't leave enough to share with him. She didn't leave anything. She really makes that story into probably less than what it even was, really.
My dad was from a small little town called Sherrod. My dad's family was very successful in the area. They owned a successful business that involved trucks for transport, moving storage, and buses. It was because he was mechanically inclined that he would be able, in the slave labor camps, when they would come by each morning and look for people to work, they would yell out, "We need a dozen tailors, 4 cobblers, and 2 mechanics." And so if you had the skill, you raise your hand, and that was your ticket for another day of living.
My mother's family brought to Auschwitz a jar of mine bread, a kind of roux made from flour and fat, used to make soup with vegetables or dumplings. They thought they were going somewhere to work, and that they would be living as a family and cooking. I don't know what happened to it, because presumably my grandmother held it, and she was sent straight to the gas chambers with the younger siblings, while my mother and aunt were sent to the barracks to be considered for work. In the reaction to being separated, I don't think anyone thought about the argument. The
Well, my mother must have thought of it with longing in the cold, starving months that followed. This is something that my parents made when I was born. When I was born, they really had very, very little money, and not to spare, but they made me this little gold disc. And they're the dates each of my parents was liberated, one on each side. By them choosing to make this for me when I was just a baby, it shows the importance they put on their liberation and on transmitting to their infant daughter the importance of that.
They were liberated from the camps, having nothing, nowhere to go, nothing left. My father couldn't return to his home. Somebody had taken it over. He knew that for a fact, and they told him not to go back because if the person living there found him, they would probably kill him. So he couldn't go back for pictures, memorabilia, or even to see, other family members, extended family members. No place to meet.
I'll tell you an interesting story about Shimon, my dad's only surviving brother. There were 7 in his family, 7 siblings, and only he and his brother survived. After the war, they couldn't find each other on any list. But my dad knew how to drive. And driving was actually a skill that many people didn't have cars back then. And so after the war, he worked for the UN, delivering goods to various DP camps. And one afternoon, he pulled into a depot where the camp was. He came out of the truck that he was driving, and from across, somebody yells, "Hey, Shimon." Dad looks around where they came from. He walks up to the guy. He goes, "What did you call me?" He goes, "Shimon, you know me. I just saw you 2 days ago." He goes, "No, my name is Yaakov." He goes, "Where did you see Shimon?" He goes, "Well, he drives a truck too." And it was another part of Germany. He had a route that he was going. And so he told my dad where the terminal was that he picked up the goods. My dad took a train or however he got there, I can't remember, and met up with his brother as he came in, pulled into the truck one day. Otherwise, they probably never would have come across each other. Because, the lists, they're random as to who's where. And that's how you found his brother.
Oftentimes I would have to explain to my friends. They would pull me aside and say, "Hey, do you know your mom has a tattoo on her arm?" And that was her Auschwitz number, 85674. She was told by the GI doctors who liberated them and gave them the physicals as they came into the DD camps that, one, she should count her lucky stars that she was alive, but that she would never have children again because of the squalor and the malnourishment and the medications they gave them to not have periods and stuff like that.
Recalled to life, nursed to health by the Red Cross, survivors in Bergen Belgium formed social groups in accord with their city of origin. This is where Ben and Bella met and married in 1946. 2000, they were relocated to a displaced persons camp in Neufreimann, Munich. This is where Solomon, Sam, the first child, was born in 1947. His difficult delivery foreshadowed his later relationship with his parents. After 48 hours of labor and unsuccessful assistance by a midwife, Dr. Bauer, a denazified German, was called in. No other doctors were available. In addition to fears inherent in protracted labor, Bella's baby was being delivered by a former Nazi. Chillingly ironic, the Nazis had exterminated Bella's entire family, but was now bringing forth new life for her.
I never really fully appreciated how much it must have been difficult, how much it hurt, all the losses that my mother suffered. I just knew what I was experiencing within our family unit. So everything got a little bit muddled. I always knew. I mean, there were things that they'd always explain that related to that, like how we had no grandparents. So there was no trauma of realizing it. But I think that's a tremendously beneficial thing that they did for us. This is my parents on the day they were naturalized, and me. Of course, my brother and I were already American citizens, and we might have given them a little grief about how they weren't until this day.
When I came here in 1949, I knew no English. My home language was Yiddish. I saw other children that interacted with themselves. They seemed to know what they're talking about, but to me, it was blah, 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 blah. So I went up to a group of kids and said blah, 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 blah. After that, I knew, number one, I was embarrassed. Number two, I knew that I was different than anybody else. That's at a very young age, 4 or 5 years old.
I used to think that everyone had parents that were survivors growing up. But in my household, my father was a very strict disciplinarian. You couldn't really ask for anything or share anything. We were 6 kids and we were all what he called good kids. There was no bantering about or playing games with your parents. It was very much children should be seen and not heard kind of thing. That's how I was growing up in that home.
My parents were very frugal. They were always very conservative about everything. They didn't spend a lot of money. They always tried to keep whatever they had because they never knew what would happen the next day. They were trying to provide for their 5 children anything that they needed, not exactly what we wanted, but what was needed for our growth and development. I really wanted so badly to have grandparents, especially a grandmother, which I never had. And right now I'm working in a nursing home, and I acquired so many grandparents, so I feel like I fulfilled my need without even knowing about it. And I was educated, I was told always, study, because this is something nobody can take away from you.
Birthdays were really great. The same 3 people with the same homemade cake.
You got to invite all the friends that you wanted as long as it was a Klein and Sam.
We had no birthday parties, okay? You got to pick, maybe you got roast instead of meatloaf that day.
There was a treat though. Mom would bring home a half-gallon of Neapolitan ice cream because you could choose between chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry all at once. So that was like, wow.
Yeah, no parties.
My mother loved to bake and cook, and of course she had this huge family in Cleveland, so they were always very festive, happy celebrations. And my father was present, but he was somber. He was the one that everybody would turn from, what's with him? You always thought something was wrong because he was so rude.
Radiating grace through a fading tattoo. I'm a 2nd-generation Holocaust survivor. When I reflect on my upbringing, the key elements of our family values are education, hard work, and giving to those in need. I believe that's how my father survived during and after the atrocities of the Holocaust in Europe. My father, Henry Landworth, miraculously endured 5 concentration camps between the ages of 13 and 18. During the war, his tormentors only knew him by his number B4343. His strength and courage persevered, even though his entire family, except for his twin sister Margot, was violently murdered by the Nazis, which means in essence, I too lost my entire extended family. My father was a complicated man and loved us as much as he possibly could. We all tried to cope with his emotional distance and not cause him any further pain or unhappiness. Like many other second-generation Holocaust survivors, being well-behaved children meant never disappointing our parents or letting them down. When we visited Auschwitz together in 2003, he told me they stripped him naked, shaved his head, branded a tattoo, gave him a uniform, and ordered him to stand in line. No one recognized each other, as they all looked the same. To the Nazis, they were all just numbers. As my father's memory fades, so do the tattoo numbers on his arm. But as a second-generation Holocaust survivor, I'm here to pick up the torch, keep his memory alive, and share our story.
I think what it really hit home to me was the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I came home from middle school. I think I was a 7th grader at that point. And my mother was sitting in front of the TV, as absolutely white as a sheet, and we were all shocked, but she seemed almost catatonic. And so I said to her, "What's wrong?" And she said, she looked at me and she said, "Just wait. Tomorrow they're going to come for us." Because in her mind, that's what happened whenever there was a national problem. They came for the Jews. And so, in a sense, it was clear to me she had never really left Germany. She had mental bags still packed, ready to flee. And some of that's, I think, when I understood that this historical experience was living on, in that sense. And I was, I didn't process this very at the time. It became clear to me in retrospect. That's when I understood that this event, this experience, was again part of the things that I had to live with, as a child of survivors.
I don't want the Holocaust to be the only thing that either represents or connects me to my father. I want what was good and beautiful and rich and awe-inspiring about being Jewish to be the thing that keeps me connected. I think his losses were inconsolable and even incalculable, but he was a Jew, and he would have never wanted us to not be Jewish. Imagine growing up where every time you were a bad girl, you felt guilty, not for what you did, but because you were injuring your parents that were already so injured. One of the things, I was never allowed to touch anything in the kitchen. I couldn't turn the water faucet on. I couldn't pour a glass of water for myself, even when I was 5 or 6 years old. I wasn't allowed to touch anything that was electrical. I couldn't turn a knob. I couldn't turn a light switch on. There were a lot of crazy rules which didn't make any sense, but it made sense to them somehow. It always seemed like everything was more precious than I realized.
I was just a child, so the time frame would be the 1950s. My father, a Holocaust survivor, living in the States just a little over a decade, worked in the produce department of a food market. His boss did little, if anything, to hide his anti-Semitic views. There was one instance, however, that clearly crossed the threshold of outright and deliberate demonstration of antagonism and racism. My father's boss, arrogantly looking down at my shorter dad, had given him yet another hard time, finally telling him point blank, "Morris, I don't like you." The anti-Semitic overtones remained unspoken, but were well expressed nonetheless.
Mustering his survivors' chutzpah, my father stood tall and responded with, "Hitler told me the same thing. I'm here. Where is he?" The confrontation ended. My father had gained yet another victory.
My brother and I understood at some level that we were living lives that in part compensated my parents for the traumas they had experienced, and that our success was extraordinarily meaningful to them, almost perhaps more meaningful to them than to us. And at the same point, we understood that the expectations of us were extraordinarily high. I remember once bringing home a report card to my father, straight A's, and my father said, "Why not A pluses?" And I said, "Because they don't give them." And he said, "Well, if you've done well enough, they would have." And it was, my father, I suppose, was one of those people who believed that self-esteem was not a trait to be encouraged, but a problem that should be managed. Self-esteem was not a good thing. You should be humble and you should, in a sense, be prepared to be ground down at some level. I think it was a very pessimistic life view, but one that was consistent with his experience. But we were aware we were accomplishing for my parents, and in a way for our grandparents. We sort of understood anything we did had the weight of multiple generations behind it.
I was about 8 years old. We were piling into my father's station wagon, going to visit my grandmother, and I got my fingers stuck in the car door. And a child today would yell out and cry, and back then I just held my hand for the entire half-hour drive to my grandmother's house because I didn't want to show any emotion. First of all, my father probably would have been angry with me for yelling out. Plus, the mentality was, a survivor, you don't cause them any kind of anguish or angst of any kind, so you just were always a good girl.
It's funny, growing up, we thought we lived, middle class and modesty. We really didn't know how poor we were. But by my parents' standards, it was wonderful.
You had more food than you could eat.
The first house, it was a 2-bedroom clapboard house. And so there's bedroom for mom and dad, and 1 bedroom for 3 kids. Well, it was a pretty small house. There were only room for 2 beds. So this guy right here and I slept together. The happiest day of my childhood was when he went off to college. And we got to split up in a twin bed. Okay? I thought everybody slept that way. So
people in camp didn't have
that's right. Even though we were immigrants, we never went without anything. We thought growing up in America was just the greatest thing, amazing that we could experience. But the one thing, and I think Kyle and Sam would agree with this, that I was jealous of growing up was not having grandparents. And now that all 3 of us, thank God, are grandparents, I realize what a void that was.
There was a lack of joy. There was a lack of fun. That wasn't part of, and being an only child, I didn't have that other sibling to play with. So it was a very quiet household. They didn't have a lot of money, but they saved money to buy me a piano because that was my father's dream, to have me be a concert pianist. And I think I'm totally talentless when it comes to piano. But I had a piano and took lessons and never really did very well with it. I did okay, like most of the kids that I knew. We all, didn't want to practice and were forced to practice. And it became a huge issue between my father and I. And one time he decided he was so angry with me that he would stop speaking to me for a year as a punishment. And he kept it up. He stopped speaking to me for almost a year, maybe longer. I don't know. He really never got back to speaking to me after that, actually. That happened when I was 8 or 9. And we never really had a good relationship after that.
On another sultry hot summer evening when my mother served a typical meat and potatoes meal, my father asked, "What, no soup?" She answered, "Arne, it's 90 degrees outside. How can you eat soup?" To which he answered,
Heart is heart, and soup is soup. That gem went into a lexicon of expressions my sisters and I continued to quote the rest of our lives when we wanted to make a case for something that was completely illogical. I thought my father was incredibly strong. He had survived impossible odds. He left Poland on foot. He walked from Poland through countries in Europe, ended up as a stowaway on a ship, got to Turkey, ended up in Palestine, fought in Israel's War of Independence. No weakling could have done that. And on the other hand, my perception of him was that he was frail, that he needed to be protected, because he was so sad. When I was 10, our mother was in the hospital, and he was so discombobulated, he was so shaken. She really managed our household. He was so lost. And I at one point I said, Daddy, I thought you were strong. And he cried. He said, I'm not strong, I'm not strong. My mother was a dressmaker and made most of my clothes and her own clothes. And she had this terrible memory being in Germany in the DP camp when survivors came back from the camps in their striped pajamas. And she never forgot that. And I wasn't allowed to ever wear stripes or have used stripes, you know, in a room, or stripes just were not something that made her comfortable. She also could not go to sleep unless all the lights were on in our house, so we slept with lights on every night. One of my memories of my mother.
As a child, my mother and father never spoke to me about their parents and siblings that had been killed during the Holocaust. Nor did they expound on their encounter with the humiliation and horror of discrimination and intended extermination. I innately knew that my job was to live a perfectly flawless existence and to be an exemplary child. My parents proudly remarked on what a perfect child I had been. I always did as I was told and could sit in a restaurant for hours while the adults carried on conversations. It was as if I were literally a living doll. I never shared problems that I might have encountered at school or my social life, because I wanted them to find comfort in this dream of perfection. My parents, as I said in regret, wanted my life to be perfect. They didn't want my life to be tainted in any way by their experiences. So they were living maybe vicariously through this existence they created for me. I always wanted grandparents, because all my friends had grandparents, and I adopted people. and I think that my need was, I think I wore it on my soul and on my person, and I think people took me in and made me their grandchild, so to speak. And after my mother died, I looked for mothers. So I think we all want family, or I shouldn't speak for everybody. I want family. I think that's a very important part of a happy life.
It's just like an overwhelming feeling. It's just more emotion about this is who we are, this is what my grandparents died for, and all the other Jews, and all the other people, it wasn't just Jews, but all millions of Jews who perished. And when we are here, that we should do justice in some way, that we should perpetuate the Jewish race. On the one hand, any parent wants better for their child, but I think my father was conflicted. He wanted, certainly never wanted us to suffer, but he wanted us to know that suffering is possible. So we inherited his guilt. I think that marks second-gen Holocaust survival. Guilt.
I'm a second-generation survivor. I didn't experience what he did, but I experienced him. And thank God now my children are well-rounded people, independent people, and they're raising their children to express themselves and just to be, so it's like, you know, when you have a stain in a clothing, it takes many washes to get it all out, so it's, you know, it's taking many washes, but everything is working out.
We had in the family 5 children. Each one of us is married and has children on their own. And at the moment, We cannot get together in one household anymore. From just 2 people, we are now about 75. So I would want to say that Hitler did not succeed and never will. We need to remember that a thing like this happened, and we need to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Propaganda supporting the denial that the Holocaust was even transpiring was also painstakingly being developed throughout that infamous and detestable period. Did I use the term denial? Surely the world could not deny such obvious and extensive evidence of the death and destruction of millions upon millions of lives. Surely the world could not deny that deliberately turning a blind eye could in actuality be labeled as participating in murder. Surely, in all the aftermath, the world could not deny the seemingly endless discoveries of gas chambers, incinerators, and piles of bones belonging to Hitler's victims. Surely the world could not deny the anguished faces and emaciated bodies of the tortured as displayed in pictures and newsreels. Surely the world could not deny the recounting of the brutality by those who managed to survive. Surely the world could not deny the testimony of a survivor's family describing life with what remained physically, mentally, and emotionally of the loved one designated as having been freed. Surely the world could not. Or could it?
When my grandson had his Brit Milah, his circumcision ceremony, it was such a tremendous feeling that I didn't really want him to have the circumcision ceremony, because all of a sudden that's going to mark him as a Jew. You see, what's the possibility of people becoming in leadership roles, someone like Hitler. Hitler was elected. It could happen anywhere. And here in the States, it could happen too.
Our story is uniquely ours, with many pages missing. That distinction is one we know we share with other survivor families. I've been to Israel many times, and I never stop picturing the moment when I find a relative or neighbor who knew my dad or his family. When I stand next to other visitors to the Washington Holocaust Memorial, I look to see if I can detect resemblance between us. I wonder if everyone there is looking at the exhibits like I do, trying to see if I see my eyes, the shape of my nose, or my chin in the faces in the photos. Am I who I am because I am a Jewish second-generation Holocaust survivor? I don't know that I will ever answer the question to my own satisfaction. I wonder what my grandsons, born to non-Jewish mothers, will say about me when they are grown. The missing pages of our family story are gone forever. The gene mutates. Life. Life defiantly goes on. You don't have to have been Jewish. You don't have to have lost personal family members to be connected to what that episode meant to you. And now it couldn't be more clear that these stories need to be told. And it's not about pity or being an alarmist, but it is a warning. We have to remember these stories, we have to tell them, because they didn't happen again.
But 25 years after the war was over, he went back, and he went back to the concentration camp where he was. And he told me he was so appalled because it was just a flat farmer's field. There wasn't even a sign there. It was a smaller, it wasn't one of the ones like Auschwitz or one of the more well-known ones, it was in Austria, it was called Schaffenburg, and it was a labor camp. But many people were buried there. Everything was just razed to the ground. He felt very invalidated by just having a farmer's field.
The atrocity is so beyond comprehension that I don't know how we can grasp it to stop it happening again.
Throughout my life, my father always talked about the fact that people could have stopped it if they had simply refused to participate and had opposed it early on.
I think everybody needs to learn to speak up when things are not right. Don't just let it happen.
Nobody would ever want to go through the Holocaust. But being a survivor in many ways, I feel has been a blessing. I learned to value things in life that a lot of people take for granted. It has brought me closer to my Jewish people and given me depth of understanding I don't think I would have had my father not been a survivor and me being a second generation survivor.
I really didn't grow up defining myself in the terms of being a second generation Holocaust survivor, but now as an adult, looking back, I do see it very much as part of my fabric.
We lived with two survivors. I always thought they were incredibly well-adjusted, and in spite of everything, very uplifting, positive people.
With their legacy, it's, our job to continue their legacy, to continue to tell the story.
We were able to see my father work hard and make something of his life, follow his dreams, and encouraged us to do that as well.
I had a pride for my parents because they escaped and they lived. My parents were a blessing to me. Even with all the garbage that happened, they were still a blessing to me.
I feel it is a responsibility to share these stories that happen and also to listen to the survivors that are still alive today.
I want the stories to be told not so people will feel sorry, but will appreciate just what it took to survive and to prosper. And I think that's a remarkable accomplishment. And it gives me hope that other people who experience those kinds of genocidal treatments can also achieve life. And we should celebrate what they managed to do and appreciate the strengths that they've conveyed to us.